Tonight, we begin with a decision that had Republican strategists reaching for their phones. A decision that unfolded not in the halls of Congress, but in the highest court in the land. A decision that the Democratic National Committee had been preparing for months. Months of legal strategy. Months of constitutional research. Months that culminated in 4 words that are now echoing through every Republican war room in America: wholly un-American. And to understand why those words matter, why they landed like a hammer on the marble steps of the Supreme Court, you have to understand what's really at stake here. Because this isn't just about one case. This isn't just about one election. This is about the fundamental architecture of American democracy itself. Sources familiar with the Democratic legal strategy tell us that party leadership had been watching this case move through the courts for months. Watching, waiting, and preparing a response that legal analysts are now calling one of the most aggressive constitutional defenses of voting rights in modern history, and the RNC. According to officials speaking on background, they didn't see this coming. They thought they had a clear path. They thought the legal terrain was theirs. They thought wrong. Now, for weeks, there had been signals, quiet signals. It's the kind of signals that only those paying very close attention would notice. Democratic attorneys had been unusually silent in public. Legal filings that normally would have generated press conferences were submitted without fanfare. Party officials who usually couldn't resist a cable news appearance suddenly had nothing to say. And in Washington, whenever the lawyers go quiet, it means the brief is about to get loud. What we now know is that behind closed doors, the DNC was assembling something unprecedented. A legal argument so comprehensive, so meticulously documented, that one constitutional scholar speaking on condition of anonymity described it as a masterclass in democratic defense. But the RNC didn't know that. What they knew was that their case was moving forward. What they knew was that the legal calendar favored their timeline. What they knew was that decades of effort were about to pay off. What they didn't know was what was coming. And then it happened. Tuesday morning, 9:47 a.m. Eastern. The DNC filed its formal intervention in the case. A 94-page brief that landed on the Supreme Court docket like a constitutional earthquake. But it wasn't the length that mattered. It was on the legal citations, though sources say there were over 200. It was on even the procedural arguments, which legal experts are calling airtight. It was the language, wholly un-American. 3 words. 3 words that the Democratic National Committee chose to describe the RNC's efforts. 3 words that transformed a legal filing into a moral indictment. And make no mistake, this language was chosen deliberately, according to Democratic strategists. The phrase went through 17 drafts. 17. Because party leadership understood that this wasn't just about winning a court case. This was about framing the entire debate. This was about telling the American people exactly what is at stake, and the RNC's response. Within hours, Republican officials were scrambling. Press statements were revised. Talking points were redistributed. A unified message that had taken weeks to craft suddenly needed to be rewritten, because they understood what had just happened. They understood that the DNC hadn't just entered the case. They had changed the case. They had elevated it from a legal dispute to a referendum on American values themselves. So what does this actually mean? What happens now? And why should every American be paying attention? Let's start with the legal implications. Constitutional scholars speaking to multiple outlets say that the DNC's intervention fundamentally changes the dynamics of this case. Before, the RNC had a relatively clear path. They had their arguments. They had their precedents. They had their strategy. Now they're playing defense. Now they're not just arguing their position, they're arguing against the charge that their position is, in the DNC's words, wholly un-American. And that's a very different legal battle. But the implications go beyond the courtroom. Because what the DNC has done, what their legal team has accomplished with this filing, is nationalize the debate. This isn't a case that will be decided in obscurity anymore. This isn't a procedural matter that most Americans would never hear about. This is now a front-page story, a cable news story, a story that will be discussed at kitchen tables across America. That's exactly what the DNC wanted. According to Democratic strategists, the party made a calculated decision. They could have intervened quietly. They could have filed a standard legal brief with standard legal language. They could have played it safe. They chose not to. They chose confrontation. They chose clarity. It chose to tell the American people, in terms that leave no room for ambiguity, exactly what they believe is at stake. And the response has been immediate. Within hours of the filing, Democratic officials across the country were echoing the language. Wholly un-American became a rallying cry. Social media exploded with the phrase. Cable news panels devoted segments to analyzing those three words. Meanwhile, Republican officials found themselves in an unfamiliar position, explaining, defending, justifying. And in politics, when you're explaining, you're losing. So where does this go from here? What happens next? And what should Americans be watching for? First, the legal timeline. The Supreme Court will consider the DNC's intervention in the coming weeks. According to court observers, there are several possible outcomes, but the DNC's entry into the case makes certain outcomes far more likely than they were before. Second, the political timeline. We are now entering an election season where this case and the DNC's framing of it will be front and center. Every debate, every press conference, every campaign event, the phrase wholly un-American will be there, hanging in the air, demanding a response. And third, this is what sources say has Republican leadership most concerned: the precedent. Because if the DNC's intervention succeeds, if the Supreme Court rejects the RNC's arguments, it will in just affect this case. It will establish a framework, a constitutional framework that will shape voting rights litigation for a generation. And that's what this is really about. Not one election, not one case, not one legal filing. This is about the future of American democracy itself. This is about who gets to vote, how they vote, and whether their votes will count. And the DNC, with this filing, has made clear where they stand. History will record this moment. History will remember that when the fundamental right to vote was challenged, the Democratic National Committee responded with 4 words that left no room for doubt: wholly un-American. The question now is how the Supreme Court will respond, and how the American people will respond. Because in the end, this isn't a case that will be decided by 9 justices alone. It will be decided by 330 million Americans who will render their own verdict at the ballot box. And that verdict, according to Democratic officials, is exactly what the RNC is afraid of. If this story matters to you, if you believe that voting rights deserve this kind of attention, then I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell. Because this case is just beginning, and we're going to be following every development, every filing, every response. Drop a comment below. What do you think wholly un-American means for this case? And share this video with someone who needs to understand what's really at stake. Because democracy isn't a spectator sport, and neither is this channel. We'll see you tomorrow.